Hello, this is another video in the Linux Random Stuff playlist. We'll cover some useful things with regards to logging in using SSH. Logging into SSH always means that there is some authentication method involved. There are multiple methods with which you can authenticate yourself, but for now we'll focus on password authentication and public key authentication. In the end, public key authentication is generally regarded to be a safer method, since you do not have to remember the password of the remote user, and also, if password authentication on the server is disabled, intruders cannot guess passwords, simply because they're not prompted for one. What we'll do is the following. We'll first log in to a remote machine using a password. Then we will disable password authentication by changing the server's sshd_config file. Then we will enable a selected user to use a password for logging in by changing the server's sshd_config file once more. And then we will use public key authentication by generating a key pair for the client and copying the public key to the remote user's authorized keys file. And we will do that using SSH copy ID as well as manually. First, we log in from the client to the server using a password. The top screen is my client and the bottom screen is the server. On the server we've got lab user 1 and lab user 2. They both have a password that we can use to log in as Rocky from the client to both users on the server. So let's quickly test that. First we connect as lab user 1, we enter the password and we exit again. And we repeat that, but then as lab user 2. We enter the password, we log in and we exit again. So that works. Next thing we do is we will disable password authentication on the server. For this we need to modify the sshd_config file in etc ssh. And we need root privileges for this. So we open the file and search for the password authentication parameter. And then we change it to no. Make sure you also remove the hash at the beginning of the line, otherwise it will simply stick to the default. We save the file and restart SSHD. Then we go back to the client and try to log in as lab user 1 and lab user 2, and we see as expected that we will not be prompted for a password. And since we have no public key set up, we'll be denied access because of that. So now let's allow lab user 1 to log in using a password again as the only user in this case. We need to modify the config file again and go all the way to the end of the file where we find the match user part. In there we can add lab user 1, which will allow lab user 1 to log in using a password. So we override the setting on a per user basis. We save the file and restart SSHD again. So now lab user 1 should be prompted for a password, and that works. And lab user 2 is still denied access. Now let's make sure that Rocky will be able to log in as lab user 1 without a password. So we need a key pair on the client and then send the public key to the respective user, so that we can log in without a password. SSH keygen is the command for this, and it requires a type. Now let's pick RSA as the type. We could just as well have gone for any of the other types, but we pick RSA. The first thing it asks is the location to store the key pair. Well, let's stick with the default. Then we can enter a passphrase. This is to protect your private key for if your local user gets compromised. But we don't do that for now, so we simply press enter. Next I run SSH copy ID to lab user 1. This will copy the public key of Rocky to the lab user's authorized keys file on the server. So now when Rocky logs in as lab user 1, there is an automatic login based upon the public key. At this moment we should disable the password authentication bit in sshd_config for this user because it's no longer needed. But we're lazy, so we leave it the way it is. And when we try to copy our public key to lab user 2, of course we fail because there's no prompt for the user's password, so permission denied. But there are other ways to provide lab user 2 without public key. For example, by email. But in this case, we can simply copy and paste our public key in the authorized keys file for lab user 2 on the server. So we log into the server and switch to lab user 2. We create the .ssh directory in the home directory and we cd into it, and then we open a new file called authorized_keys. And then we switch to the client once more and go to the SSH directory of Rocky, and we list our keys, and then we open the public key and put it in a buffer. We once more switch back to the server and paste it in the file, which we can then write and quit. We set the correct permissions, which would be read-write for the user, and now we can try and log in as lab user 2 without a password. And we succeed. So we're very happy and we're done.